Hello everyone. Welcome back to Continue Learning. Today, we will take a look at the functions define add and define sub. This is also a common issue that beginners encounter with define. The question is, what is the difference between these two functions and define? In terms of the formula structure, they are almost identical. However, in practice, define add and define sub offer more flexibility compared to define. This flexibility is what we call relative specification. At this point, you may be confused about what relative specification is. No worries, let's first review the concept of define. The function define allows us to specify detailed levels of calculation. We can use these three parameters to specify which indicator to aggregate, how to aggregate it, and based on which dimension. Additionally, the third parameter includes filtering conditions. The key point we will focus on today is the dimension part. When writing the define function, the dimension on which the calculation is based is a fixed and absolute state. In other words, it is determined by the parameters you've written in the function. On the other hand, define add or define sub differs in that it is based on a relative state. Let's take define add as an example. In this case, if the dimension inside the function is area, but the analysis area, which you drag into the dimension column, includes other fields, the calculation will consider both the function-specified dimensions and the dragged-in dimensions. Thus, the result of the aggregation can vary based on which fields you drag into the analysis area. This is the flexibility of define add. Let's try a practical example to better understand this abstract description. The task is to analyze data with the dimensions of customer name and the calculation function define add sum AGG with the dimension province. Now, the question is, if we use define to write this function, what formula should we use? Take a moment to think about the answer. The correct answer here is option C. Why? Because, as mentioned earlier, the actual calculation of define add is based on two parts of the dimension. One part comes from the formula, and the other comes from the analysis area. In the example, the analysis area dimension is customer name, and the formula dimension is province. Thus, when aggregating sales, the dimension used is province and customer name. This means that the result will depend on both the dimension in the formula and the dimension dragged into the analysis area. So when you rewrite it using define, the calculation is only based on the formula dimensions, and the analysis area dimensions are not involved. Therefore, we need to include both dimensions in the formula, which is why we choose option C. Option A is incorrect because it places the province dimension in the wrong place, within the third parameter for filtering conditions. Now, let's dive deeper into the difference between define add and define sub. With define add, the dimensions involved in the addition come from both the analysis area and the formula. On the other hand, define sub is used for subtraction. The dimension used in define sub for aggregation comes from the analysis area, and it subtracts the formula-specified dimension. Let's take another example to understand define sub. The task is to calculate the average sales for each region in every quarter. In the final output, the horizontal axis represents the year and quarter, and each bar shows the sales amount for each region. The horizontal line represents the average sales value for all regions in that quarter. To calculate this, we need to first sum up the total sales for all regions in a given quarter and then divide by the number of regions to get the average sales. Back in our Find BI, we drag the sales date and region fields, then adjust the granularity of the sales date and drag sales to the vertical axis. At this point, we almost have the desired output. But the next challenge is to calculate the total sales for all regions in that quarter, which we need for the average calculation. This is where define sub comes in handy, as it allows us to remove the impact of the region dimension already present in the analysis area. In define sub, we will sum up sales and exclude the region dimension from the formula, leaving only the sales date dimension. Now, we can proceed to divide the result by the number of regions to get the average sales. To summarize, the key difference between define add and define sub lies in how they handle dimensions. Define add combines the dimensions from the formula and the analysis area, while define sub subtracts the formula-specified dimension from the analysis area. Remember that add corresponds to an increase in the dimension, and subtract corresponds to a reduction. By understanding how these functions interact with the dimensions, you can better apply them in your future analysis tasks.